Hey Miranda, how you doing? Thank you so much for including your work here. I was just reading through your writing here. It says you think you made a mistake without attempting any adjustments. And I agree. I think anytime that you have type that's set above 12 points, you definitely want to start looking at individual letter spacing and word spacing, specifically if it's in a headline capacity or display type. Quite often, text is able to be adjusted not individually with kerning, but adjusting the spacing between the letters in the entire sentence, which is called tracking. There's a difference between kerning and tracking, and I think it's very, very important for students to understand those differences and to understand where to use tracking and where to use kerning. Again, in summary, you're going to use kerning more in situations where you're using larger type and display type or headlines or something like that. And that stands to reason. The larger the type, the more noticeable inconsistencies in spacing is going to be. Plus, if you try to kern individual letters in body copy, it's just going to be a nightmare because there's just literally thousands of characters in any given paragraph. So it wouldn't be feasible to go in and try to kern individual spaces between letter forms in body copy. In that situation, we can adjust the spacing between letters in the entire paragraph or the entire line or even a selected set of words by adjusting the tracking associated with those selections. Okay, yeah, a lot of what you're saying here is good, and this is great because based on your writing, and this is why I think it's so important for students to submit a couple of really detailed paragraphs with any submission, not only in this class, in all of your classes, because it tells me and tells us as instructors what you're learning. So theoretically, and quite often, I learn as much about what you're learning from your writing as I do from the work. And this particular case is no exception, as you are stating the inconsistencies. So by writing out the inconsistencies here that you notice, you're telling me that you know that that is a mistake, that that exists, and that you understand the reasoning why. So please, as we move through the class, please keep on submitting a nice written summary with your assignments. I've got the JPEG up right here, and I've also got a little kind of supplemental file here I've been using, and this is just for comparative sake. And what I consider this to be is I went ahead and I kerned this and spaced this word to what I think is optimal for a headline or a display purpose. And the reason, as you've gathered from last week's and from this week's lectures, the reason that we want to have such good spacing, and the reason spacing is so important, is it allows expeditious reading of groups of words without stumbling in unnecessary or unusual spaces. Okay, so for an example, this fire and ice, the mind is able to perceive this as one group of words, one kind of thought, so to speak, fire and ice. If you take this particular typeset right here, and if this space right here is wider than this perceived space right here, then that creates a break right there. And the mind picks up on that break, and the mind tries to organize that break as groups. So in other words, if this space right here were wider than this space, or if this space here were too wide, the mind would look at this, our minds would look at this and say, fire and ice, because that's what you're telling the viewer. You're telling the viewer there's a break there. We don't want that. We want this to be registered as fire and ice. Therefore, the spacing needs to be impeccable. We can say the same thing with individual letters too. So if this space here were wider than this space right here, we would pick this up as ICE as opposed to ice. That's another stop for us. Our minds kind of group things according to, our mind always wants to organize things. So when we make these groups of perceived elements, that's our mind at work trying to make logical groupings of things. So unusual letter spacing quite often makes unusual groupings not intended by the communication. Okay, I hope that makes sense. That's a critical point in all of typography. And if you're not getting that, let me know and I'll clarify it. It's really of relevant importance as we move forward in our study of typography. Okay, that said, let's go ahead and take a look at your work. So I think the main thing, and you mentioned this in your writing, is that there's some inconsistencies and some distortions. And I think I have a feeling I know the reason why, and I'm guessing that this was photographed with your phone as opposed to scan. If you have a chance to scan your work, if you're ever presenting your work, get it in a scanner, especially if you're presenting work to a client or a creative director or art director. You don't ever want to take a picture of it. The reason is that if there's any deviation in that camera angle at all, it's going to create distortions. And we can clearly see that, and that's a lot of your verticals aren't true verticals, rather they are somewhat distorted. Now, if this were a scan is going to sit flat on that glass, and if there are distortions, it's in the document itself and not in the way it's captured, okay? Again, another critical point, something that's really, really important. If you're going to use your camera as opposed to a scanner, first of all, by all costs, use the scanner whenever you're presenting, especially in a professional setting when you get to that level. But as far as if you're shooting with your camera, just make sure that document is on the desk flat and that camera is right over it, not at an angle, not tilted forward or back, not tilted to the side, but perfectly level above that document. That will prevent any distortions. But again, if at all possible, scan your work. All right, let's get down to business here. So your spacing looks pretty good. A couple of things you mentioned. This is just really entirely too close. That kind of throws off everything. The thing about kerning and letter spacing is that you kind of want to start. Everything is based on where you start. So if you start in an area that is too tight, if your first letters are kerned too tight, the rest is going to be kerned too tight. As we kind of follow the lead of what we set up, and that's what we say that the perception, it's perceived. We're shooting for a perceived balance of volume in between letters. I say perceived, and that's an important term because these are not going to be the same kerning values. They're going to be different. However, they appear to consume the same volume based on the shapes and the counterforms of the letters themselves. Okay, so I think fire is looking pretty darn good, except for that E. I would also say you might even, well, actually, no, you're good. You're good. And looks pretty good. I think the D is a little too far. I want to close that down a little bit. I think ice looks great with the exception of this. These two curved letter forms are just a little too close. So again, in summary, this is good. This is good. This is too narrow. This is good. This is too wide. This is good. This is too narrow. As far as the letter spacing goes, I'm sorry, the word spacing, I think you're good here. I think that we're able to look at this and see fire and ice as opposed to fire and ice or fire and ice. So your word spacing looks very good. Now, one of the other things I want to mention is a couple of inconsistencies that we can see in the actual rendering of the letter forms. Watch your serifs. I mean, they really are going to be uniform, right? So that curve right there looks a little different than that curve, as well as these two. It looks to me, and again, this is probably a distortion based on the way that this was captured, but it looks like this cap line isn't level and parallel with the baseline. Baseline doesn't look level either. So okay, now the mean line, let's take a look at the mean line. See, these apex areas of the lowercase I and the lowercase n, that vertical branch on both of those, and the top of that serif, that if you can see, that extends above and beyond the mean line. So we want to represent that here. Also, we have what is called overshoot. If you take a look at the optical relationships lecture in week 2, you'll read about overshoot. Overshoot indicates that curved letter forms should sit above the mean line just a touch and below the baseline just a touch. And we can see that right here. See how that A sits below the baseline, E sits below the baseline and above the mean line. And that's relevant because that's an optical relationship to ensure that letter forms appear to be the same size. So you want to get overshoot in there. You want to get those apexes above the mean line. And other than that, you did a good job with the apex of the vertical stem of the lowercase d, specifically that serif that hangs above the cap line. That's fantastic right there. Other than that, I think you're looking really good. So those are my recommendations moving forward. If you have any questions at all, please let me know. And I'll be glad to clarify. Thank you very much.